Hello everyone, Bubba here. I normally don't do things like this video. It just isn't my thing, but I assure you this video contains a good, relevant breakdown of Professor Dave's videos attacking Dr. Tour. I have no desire to be known, seen, or attract any attention, but eventually I have to try and say something. I should have done this video so long ago, but again, this just isn't my kind of thing. I'm not sure how many people are still interested, but here we go. This video is longer than I would have liked, but to address Professor Dave's never-ending unsupported statements and countless assumptions being passed off as facts can take some time. For his own beliefs and statements, Professor Dave's standard of proof is very low, but for anyone having a different viewpoint, he will arrogantly criticize and critique everything he can from any angle he can. He does this while acting like he is some champion for truth. This is taking hypocrisy to an art form. I don't have the fancy insulting graphics Professor Dave does to help keep it interesting, but I would ask the viewer to be patient and to watch this complete video as I will share my own undeniable experience as to the reality of a real personal God at the end, and I assure you, it is a little more than finding a set of keys. Professor Dave, let me just say, he is a very intelligent, well-educated atheist. Let me also say, in his first video, Professor Dave did not elucidate any agenda other than his own. His own agenda is to discount, demean, insult, belittle, and make fun of anyone that does not think like he does. This came out in undeniable fashion. He did not prove anything. He did reveal his own true colors, but in no way did he elucidate an agenda of Dr. Tour. Professor Dave says Dr. Tour is a respected chemist and he's entitled to his religious beliefs, but then he goes on to say of Dr. Tour, it is clear his religious views cloud his capacity to interpret research on this topic, as does his gross overestimation of his own abilities. Clear to who? Not me. Professor Dave comes up with statements like that to try and discredit Dr. Tour because he doesn't like what he says. It could just as easily be said Professor Dave's evolutionary views cloud his ability to accurately interpret research on this topic. And he mentioned headspace. The headspace Dr. Tour comes from does not change facts any more than the headspace Professor Dave comes from establishes facts. From the beginning, Professor Dave is simply trying to discredit and demean Dr. Tour any way he can. When an individual goes after someone the way Professor Dave has gone after Dr. Tour, a person has to wonder why. What is the motivation and heart of the attacker? Is there some noble pursuit of truth driving it, or is he just an arrogant, intolerant, intellectual bully with a superiority complex going after someone that does not think the way he does? When it comes to modern day biology, I will listen and learn from Professor Dave. When he cites papers from scientists, I will listen and learn. When the significance of his points are distorted or overblown, I will question him. When it comes to imagination, assumption, and speculation about unobserved processes that allegedly happened in the past, I will question what he says. I want more than just because Professor Dave says so. I want more than it has to be what he is saying to support the theory of evolution. Professor Dave would say Dr. Tour sees these questions through a religious filter that distorts how he views the evidence. Professor Dave has his own evolutionary filter through which he views every question or issue associated with abiogenesis. He does the very thing he would accuse Dr. Tour of doing. It's just a different filter, and because it's Professor Dave's own filter, it's somehow okay. Quite the double standard. I will freely admit that I do not have Professor Dave's knowledge of present-day biology, and he does put forth some interesting, albeit totally unproven ideas. I enjoy learning, and I find some of the highlighted points from scientific papers he cites interesting. I am also very capable of seeing through unsubstantiated statements, assumptions, and claims. Let me put it this way. I'm not a mechanic, but I can sure tell when there's a problem with a car. When Professor Dave goes beyond what the evidence actually shows to impose his own preconceived beliefs on ideas or research, I can recognize it easily. So, let's critique the critic and see what becomes elucidating. At the beginning of the first video, Professor Dave says, Dr. Tour speaks out against abiogenesis. This is in error. He speaks out against overstated claims about what has actually been accomplished in this field. He speaks out against overhyped claims about the significance of things scientists working in abiogenesis may have accomplished, but he does not speak out against abiogenesis research itself. Professor Dave says, it is a dishonest talking point for Dr. Tour to bring up the textbook example with a lizard crawling out of a pond. I would disagree. It is not a dishonest talking point if the diagram about some lizard coming out of a pond is found in any textbook. If there's a problem with this illustration, then it shouldn't be in any textbook at any level. If a public school student sees drawings like this in a textbook, even at a lower level, where they go on to study this field more deeply or not, this unproven assumptive idea has already been planted in their mind. Professor Dave says our inability to assemble a bacterium is irrelevant. Wait, when you can't do something, you say it is irrelevant? I disagree with lowering the goals so you can hit a lesser target. When you can't hit a target, you just lower the standard? He goes on to say, the issue is to arrive at the bacterial genome, not to somehow be able to assemble a complete bacterium from its fully formed constituent parts. Is this true just because Professor Dave says so? Dr. Tour's main point is, using prebiotic materials and prebiotic conditions, we cannot make a fully functioning, real living cell with all its component pieces in place and functioning. But instead of acknowledging Dr. Tour makes a good point, Professor Dave tries to redefine the issue. To reiterate Dr. Tour's main point, motivated, driven, calculating, intelligent scientists are clueless to duplicate what mindless, pointless, directionless, uncaring nature has supposedly done. Professor Dave goes on to say, nature assembled some dramatically simpler precursor which was self-replicating and also self-improving due to natural selection. Proof? Evidence? Or is this just an unproven assumption for someone with no real concrete answers who will not allow for a creator to explain how we got life? Professor Dave says creationists appeal to a God of the gaps to address things they can't explain, while he himself ascribes limitless power to evolution of the gaps or natural selection of the gaps. The same gaps exist for him as well as the creationist. When he doesn't have a real evidence-based explanation for something, he pulls out natural selection and eons of time as rescuing devices to fill in the gaps in his own unproven assumed ideas. From the beginning, he bases arguments on imaginative, unproven assumptions. He says things as though they are established facts when indeed they are not. No, if he doesn't have real evidence, then he shouldn't say something like it is an established fact. He shouldn't say something is debunked unless he has absolute, irrefutable facts to point to. He shouldn't state assumptions as though they are facts just to come up with things that align with his non-evidence, predetermined bias. He goes on to say, every bacterial cell alive today is tremendously more complex than the first protocell that must have formed. Must have formed? He is making another unprovable assumption based on his own preconceived beliefs. He is pulling it out of the air. He goes on to say, we can't make planets and stars either. Does that mean nature can't have made them spontaneously? When he doesn't have a real answer, he always appeals to some supposed creative aspect of nature to do what he can't explain. He can come up with these unprovable imaginative ideas without end, but this does not mean anything really happened as he would imagine. It is always could have, might have, possibly, suggestive of, or some other ambiguous wording to avoid the unthinkable thought that a creative God might have done it. In his second video, Professor Dave tries to defend this type of wording, saying if Dr. Tour wanted to come to Professor Dave's house so Professor Dave can teach him some science, it is possible for Dr. Tour to come to Professor Dave's house by surface street, freeway, subway, or helicopter. But the reality is Dr. Tour is not going to come to Professor Dave's house for scientific enlightenment. It has not happened and will not happen. So while something may theoretically be possible, it does not mean it has ever happened that way or will ever happen that way in the real world. And to a degree, Professor Dave even acknowledged this. Since the way Professor Dave uses these terms in reality are for concepts and ideas that have not actually been shown to get from point A, non-life, to point B, life, what is the real point? My takeaway from this attempted explanation is this. Professor Dave will reach for anything to avoid a creator, no matter how much imagination it takes or how ambiguous or nondescript he has to get with language. On the surface, it may sound like Professor Dave's explanation of the way he uses these terms is plausible. When you itemize the way Professor Dave actually uses these terms, his analogy becomes weak and deceptive. Professor Dave will always have some way to explain problems away or make the highly improbable sound plausible. He's a very intelligent, creative person. He really is. Speaking of probability, Professor Dave tries to explain away the question of the probability, or should I say, the improbability of some of these things happening. To this one, I can only say, I've been playing the lottery for years now, and so far, the improbability of a highly unlikely event happening seems to be valid in my world. When Dr. Tour talks about the difficulty in having the inner and outer surfaces of the cell membrane being different, Professor Dave calls it a straw man argument because Dr. Tour is talking about cells as they exist today. What does Professor Dave really know about the inner and outer surfaces of cells from these supposed eons ago? Nothing. So who needs to be questioned? He then says eukaryotic cells came about through endosymbiosis from the merging of prokaryotic life forms which existed for at least 1 billion years before such endosymbiotic events occurred. Proof? Evidence? Or is this just another assumed imaginative step along the way to get life because an intellectual atheist has to have something to point to and a creator is simply unthinkable? He goes on to say, the complexity of eukaryotic cells evolved slowly over several billion years once biological processes were already firmly in place. I hate to sound like a broken record here, but proof? Evidence? Or just more assumption and imagination? I don't care if this is what is taught in classrooms. Proof. Show the evidence or call it what it is, an assumption educated atheists push in college and public school classrooms to somehow explain life without a creator. I can only hope that people listening to Professor Dave would be able and willing to apply some basic critical thinking skills to discern the assumptions he puts forth as though they are facts. Please, people, use your own brains and don't just buy into his assumptive opinions as though they're established facts. Something isn't true just because Professor Dave says so. I really don't understand why some people seem so ready to believe anything that he says when there are so many blatant and obvious non-evidence assumptions in what he says. In his second video, Professor Dave said David Hume debunked the idea that if a fully functioning watch needed a creator, then anything more complex than a watch would need a creator as well. David Hume did not like the argument, but he did not disprove or discredit the logic. Professor Dave seems to have a very low standard of proof to say something is debunked. When discussing the car with all the parts laid out, Professor Dave says the car was designed top down by man. He goes on to say biological life forms were made from the bottom up. Again, this is an assumption based on his belief in evolution and natural selection. If there truly is a creator God, then for that God, biological life forms would have been designed top down. Professor Dave just doesn't want to believe in a creator, and so he has to come up with things like this. Again, he can come up with these things without end, but in reality, it is just one more assumption based on his faith in evolution. When Dr. Tour talks about being skeptical of evolution, Professor Dave says it is based on his interpretation of Scripture. This is not true. Dr. Tour is very careful to stick to scientific facts when talking about science. He is careful to keep scientific talking points separate from speaking about his faith as a Christian. Dr. Tour believing in the Bible has nothing to do with a lack of real evidence for evolution. Professor Dave says the science supports evolution, and Dr. Tour questions that it truly does. There are real problems with the theory of evolution, whether Professor Dave or anyone else wants to acknowledge them or not. Even Charles Darwin admitted the problems with his theory, but Darwin was more intellectually honest than people like Professor Dave. Professor Dave acts like Dr. Tour's devotion to Scripture compromises him scientifically. Does Professor Dave's prior commitment to natural selection and evolution compromise him? Professor Dave talks like Dr. Tour is saying he believes in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as though this belief discredits him somehow. I don't want to get too far off topic, but the fact is there is more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead than Darwinian evolution, namely eyewitnesses. We have eyewitness testimony of multiple people that suffered horrible, awful persecution and deaths because they would not back off on their testimony they had seen him risen from the dead. While there is eyewitness testimony for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the same cannot be said for the unlimited ability of evolution and natural selection Professor Dave assumes and pushes. No one can say they have seen one animal family turn into another. Epigenetics can explain why Darwin's finches displayed variation in their beaks, but the finches still remained finches. They remained birds. Professor Dave says not believing in evolution is anti-science. I would disagree. Charles Darwin, in chapter 6 and 9 of his book Origin of Species, told the world some of the holes in his theory. The objections Charles Darwin put forth in his own writing are still very much valid. For one, Darwin's tree of life does not exist in the fossil record. He could not explain why the countless transitional forms his theory absolutely required could not be found in the fossil record. All these years later, the transitional forms have not been found. I don't care what job title you have, or if you're a member of the Evolution at All Costs support group. If you can't show me these transitional forms, don't say I'm anti-science for not believing in evolution. The only place these transitional forms have been known to exist are in the imaginations of people like Professor Dave. Professor Dave says there is not a credible biologist on Earth that does not work within the framework of evolution by natural selection. Truth is not established by a majority vote. And why does he use the word credible? If a biologist had the nerve to question or disagree with his peers on this issue, he wouldn't be credible? I really wonder how many scientists secretly question evolution but are afraid to speak out as it could hurt their careers. Any scientist daring to say anything questioning evolution will become a target for people like Professor Dave. Dr. Tour is a perfect example. Would Professor Dave have made videos about Dr. Tour if Dr. Tour embraced evolution? How dare anyone question the evolutionary status quo? Anyone questioning evolution will be punished, insulted, and ridiculed. Professor Dave's own intolerant agenda seems to be becoming elucidated. Dr. Tour talks about conversations he has had with scientists that will privately express questions about these things they would never admit publicly for fear of reprisal. I already put this away once. In a land of supposed free speech, Darwin and his theory of evolution are not to be questioned. It is sad when the search for truth is held hostage by adherence to a theory with so many holes. People like Professor Dave can demean or criticize anyone that does not agree with evolution, but they still cannot make the missing fossils appear. Professor Dave says devotion to religious belief supersedes the capacity to apply logic and reason. Why? What science holds to be true is constantly changing as we learn more. When science actually gets to the proven bottom of an issue or question, it has never been known to or been shown to contradict the Bible. Professor Dave insisting that science supports evolution might infer a conflict, but is it really the evidence that contradicts Scripture, or is it the scientist that will cling to evolution no matter what that contradicts the observable evidence? Professor Dave says it is painfully obvious that topics like evolution and abiogenesis forced Jim to reconsider his faith. Obvious to who? Dr. Tour is secure in his faith. Professor Dave says of Dr. Tour, his discomfort when discussing these topics is palpable given his loud, aggressive manner of speech where he becomes indistinguishable from a preacher. So now, the all-knowing Professor Dave says anyone speaking with some energy and enthusiasm is wallowing in discomfort. Please, let me say this again. When discussing modern day biology, I will listen to Professor Dave, give him the benefit of a doubt, and I'll try to learn from him. I will. But when he goes anywhere beyond present day biology without proof, his opinions are no more valid than anyone else's, especially when the topic is not scientific at all, but rather his opinion about Dr. Tour's speaking style. These absurdities should cause people to really analyze everything Professor Dave says. He goes on to say, the conflict of interest should now be quite clear despite his insistence to the contrary. Jim's religious views are informing his scientific stance rather than the other way around. No. If Darwin had not felt the need to point out the problems with his own theory, then maybe. If natural selection had actually been observed to have one animal family turn into another, then maybe. But it hasn't. If the fossil record included the transitional forms, then okay. But it does not. There is no conflict of interest. Just Professor Dave throwing shade on someone that does not think the way he does. Professor Dave's true colors are shining through in brilliant fashion. On the one hand, Professor Dave might have made an excellent attorney with his ability to distort what people really believe and say in order to tell the story he wants told. On the other hand, his overreaching the implications of what scientists have actually accomplished in this field, along with his own unproven assumptions, might not stand up to cross-examination so well if he were put on the witness stand himself. Professor Dave goes on to say, Jim's faith forces him to believe in an inferior God. This is just absurd. An inferior God? Well, since Professor Dave brought it up, let's talk about Dr. Tour's God. And again, please watch this till the end to hear my own personal story. Even Professor Dave can't explain away. Dr. Tour's God is the God of the Bible. Dr. Tour is a Christian. Modern archaeology is constantly making discoveries that validate the Bible. Fulfilled prophecy alone should cause an honest inquirer to take the Bible seriously. There is so much fulfilled prophecy in the Bible, it amazes me that people would not take it more seriously. I know there are always critics that will attack and distort anything they can from any angle they can regarding the Bible, and many people are just unaware, but the proof is there. Dr. Tour believes in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are hundreds of prophecies from the Old Testament that Jesus fulfilled. The odds of one person fulfilling all these prophecies for the Jewish Messiah are just overwhelming. Psalms 22 goes into detail about the way Messiah would be killed before crucifixion had been invented, and there are so many more. From the town where he would be born, to the Roman soldiers casting lots to see which one of them would get his clothing, to the amount of money Jesus' betrayer would be paid, The list of prophecies Jesus fulfilled just goes on and on. The number of people that saw the resurrected Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians 15 is amazing. If it was a made-up story, the Apostle Paul would not have mentioned so many people, many which were still alive at the time of his writing, who could have corroborated or denied the story. He's telling people, it's like he was in their face and talk to them. The Gospels record women to be the first witnesses of the resurrected Jesus. If it was a made-up story, they would not have recorded women to be the first eyewitness to his resurrection in a culture where women were not even allowed to testify in court. I've touched on it before, but what could possibly have turned men who, for the most part, had run away and hid afraid for their lives into men that would willingly accept horrible persecution and death rather than back off in their testimony they had seen Jesus risen from the dead if they hadn't actually seen it? Do people really think the disciples of Jesus invented a story so they could be persecuted and killed for telling that very story? I've heard it said there are many people that will die for what they believe to be true, but no sane person would suffer a horrible, agonizing death for what they know is a lie. And the disciples of Jesus, plural, suffered horrible persecution for proclaiming they had seen him risen. One of the disciples, Thomas, has been criticized by some Christians for doubting. He said, "I will not believe unless I can place my hands in the wounds of the resurrected Jesus." Thomas met the resurrected Jesus, and Jesus told Thomas to place his hands in the wounds and to believe. Some Christians call him Doubting Thomas, and to a degree, I understand why. But I actually appreciate Thomas. He wasn't going to believe something just because someone said so. He wanted proof. Maybe some of Professor Dave's followers could learn from Thomas's example. The thing is, Thomas got his proof. Thomas left his home and everything he had ever known to tell what he had seen and heard. Thomas was speared to death in what is now present-day India because he would not back off on his testimony that he had seen Jesus risen from the dead. What changed Thomas? Undeniable, in his face, evidence changed Thomas. When an honest skeptic that will do an objective investigation into the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, they will often come away believing. Heavy emphasis on the words honest and objective. Don't believe because a preacher says so. Don't not believe because of people like Professor Dave. Believe because the evidence says so. And the evidence is there. For anyone willing to do an honest investigation, I would recommend the books Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, or Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. For so many reasons, and what he has done in millions of lives, including mine, calling Dr. Tour's God inferior is just wrong. I know Professor Dave can really get on a roll with his arrogant, unsubstantiated opinions, but no, just no. Professor Dave's opinions do not define any reality concerning Dr. Tour's God. To begin to wrap this up, when discussing origin of life, Professor Dave makes countless, endless assumptions based on his belief that evolution is true. The papers he cites do have some interesting content, but they do not prove anything. They merely put forth possibilities for small supposed steps to try and get life from non-life. Even if something he points to could be a might be, maybe small step, the task of getting life from non-life is still undone. In other words, they are still imagination with no definitive proof that it really happened in any way Professor Dave would speculate or ever would happen, as he would try to get people to accept. At one point, with these supposed imaginative possibilities as his foundation, he basically goes on to say, from here, it is not that big of a leap to get a protocell to emerge. Not that big of a leap? Is this science? Are we really supposed to accept Professor Dave's not that big of a leap? Is this science? Is there any scientific peer-reviewed publication where not that big of a leap would be accepted? This statement alone elucidates what Professor Dave is actually doing, or at least trying to get people to accept. This is just the next step in his imaginative tale. It is imagination based on imagination. There is a section at the library dedicated to imagination. It is called the fiction section. When a scientist can show me the real, living, self-replicating cell with all its component parts in place and functioning they have made using prebiotic materials in prebiotic conditions, and not some supposed protocell along the way, but a real living cell, I will gladly acknowledge their accomplishment. But until then, back off on Dr. Tour. This all comes down to some basic issues that are often masked by the debate, rhetoric, and sometimes egos. There are highly intelligent people that, for whatever the reason, will attempt to explain a creator away no matter what. They have no real evidence-based concrete answers, but they just refuse to allow any place in their thinking for our creator. Highly intelligent people with a predetermined bias can make a case for just about any idea they want to push, and explaining how everything came from nothing seems to be a high priority for many. Professor Dave is a prime example. The underlying issue for all this is there really a creator God or not? The existence of a creator God is not true or false depending on what a scientist can do in a laboratory, what unproven ideas he will assume as fact, or anything he might say. If God is real, then he is real whether Professor Dave acknowledges it or not. I don't know if me questioning Professor Dave's limitless, unproven assumptions or the way he points to small things scientists have done and then tries to weave them into his predetermined evolutionary tale will cause any of his followers to change their minds, but I will leave the viewer with my own real-life experience to consider before blowing off Christianity. Please listen, and then if you want to blow me off, fine. If you want to blow off Dr. Tour, okay, but not Jesus, not the one the evidence says rose from the dead. If the evidence says Jesus did indeed rise from the dead, then stop. Stop the noise. Stop the endless rhetoric. Stop the insults. Stop the criticism. Just stop. If he rose from the dead, it means he is who he said he was, and he did what he said he would do. It means John 3:16 is true. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life, including Professor Dave. Including. The last thing I want to say about Professor Dave is this. Professor Dave is absolutely loved by the God he would deny. Now for my own personal story. Many years ago, there was a song out on contemporary Christian radio entitled God is Watching Over You as Always. That was also the opening line of the chorus. It was written by the bass player for the Newsboys at that time. And for me, it was just kind of a nice feel-good sentiment because about that time, I was thinking about buying a motorcycle. I had ridden as a kid and I enjoyed it, and I thought it would be nice. So shopped around. I did end up buying a motorcycle. It was like this other company's answer to a Honda Goldwing. This one, shaft drive, water cooled, inline 4, matching saddlebags, luggage compartment, fairing, cruise control, stereo, had those tall antennas off the back. So I'm older, it was older, and I did get it used. But for something of its vintage, it was actually quite nice. I was living out in the sticks north of Amarillo, Texas at the time. And I remember one weekend I was riding into town. I had the cruise control set. Stereo was turned on to Caleb Christian radio. It's kind of just more or less a background noise kind of thing. You really can't hear a lot because of the wind noise. But it was just some nice background sounds. So there's a loop that goes around Amarillo. And the road that I was on was going to go under that loop. And the loop is an overpass, and I was going to go through there. But I wanted to go through there easy because there are on-ramps and off-ramps. So I took 2 fingers, bad mistake. I took 2 fingers and tapped the front brake just to get the cruise control to release, just enough to get the cruise to release. When I did, the motorcycle went into a wobble. I've since learned that some people refer to it as a death wobble. The front wheel is just oscillating back and forth so bad, so fast. The handlebars are just, it's just awful. Instant terror. The handlebars are jerking back and forth so violently, I cannot let go of my left hand to grab clutch to try to downshift. So I'm just stabbing at the shifter, hoping maybe it'll downshift. I'm absolutely feathering in rear brake, trying to somehow get this thing shut down. Some way, somehow, I did get it shut down on the shoulder of the road. Now, the last shutter that the motorcycle made did lay it over on its side, and I was powerless to stop it because it was going over. Just too much mass, just too much. But instead of being thrown off, I stepped up and off, just like you would step up and out of a chair. The engine keeps running. The rear wheel is just spinning in the air. I remember reaching down to hit the kill switch for the engine, and the radio kept playing. And the lyric coming from the song, playing on K-Love Christian Radio at that exact moment in time, said, God is watching over you as always. I just knelt beside the motorcycle and I began to cry. See? Not only did he save me, but he audibly took credit for it. I've heard it said that a man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. And I have had the experience. No one will ever convince me there is no God. I know who saved me on the road that day. I absolutely know that. I know the one the evidence says saved me 2,000 years ago, rising from the dead. He went to the cross, he rose from the dead. The evidence says so. I know my God. Okay? If you don't know him, I would ask that you honestly do a real investigation into the claims of Christianity. Was Jesus who he said he was? Did he do what he said he would do? Please, I beg you, an honest investigation into Jesus. Please. Thank you for listening.